David Thompson's journey, the dream that turned to ashes. David Thompson had always been a man who lived by simple rules: hard work, loyalty, and love. He believed in finding a partner with whom you could build a life, a family, and a future. And when he met Emily, he was certain he had found exactly that. Their connection was instant, undeniable. It wasn't just the chemistry between them. It was the way they seemed to complement each other perfectly. Emily, with her vibrant energy, filled David's life with color. In turn, David's steady and grounded nature provided Emily with the stability she seemed to crave. Their whirlwind romance turned into a whirlwind wedding, and before long, they had two beautiful children, a daughter, Lily, and a son, Max. It was everything David had ever dreamed of. A perfect life, a perfect family. But as the years passed, the dream started to show cracks. The changing tide. David had always been consumed by his work. As an architect, his career demanded long hours and meticulous attention. But as he buried himself deeper into his projects, he started to notice the growing distance between him and Emily. She was no longer the same woman he had fallen in love with. There were no more spontaneous weekend getaways or late-night talks. Instead, she had become distant, often lost in her own world, as though something was silently eating away at her. At first, David thought it was just stress. Life, as it often does, had thrown its challenges their way. But when Emily stopped looking at him the way she used to, when she stopped smiling at the little things they used to share, that's when he began to wonder if something deeper was at play. The discovery. One night, after returning home from an exhausting day at work, David found himself in a quiet house. The kids were already asleep, and Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. The soft glow from the screen illuminated her face, but her expression was unreadable. David, feeling the distance between them more keenly than ever, walked over to kiss her on the cheek. Emily didn't look up, her fingers still scrolling through the phone. "Everything okay?" David asked, his voice filled with concern. "Yeah," she said, her response flat. "Just tired, I guess." David didn't press further, but something about her tone, the way her voice lacked warmth, stirred something in him. Later that evening, while Emily was in the bathroom, David picked up her phone, just to check the time. But something in him, something he couldn't explain, made him glance at the recent messages. The first message was from a name he didn't recognize, Ethan. It was brief, but enough to send a chill through his spine. "I miss you so much. I can't wait to see you again." David's breath caught in his throat. His hand shook as he read the message over and over, the words sinking in slowly, painfully. Could it be? Could Emily, his Emily, the woman he had built a life with, be? His heart pounded in his chest as he read more. Each message between Emily and Ethan was more intimate than the last. The way they spoke to each other, comforting, affectionate, and filled with longing, told David everything he needed to know. His world was crumbling in his hands. The confrontation. David knew he couldn't avoid the truth any longer. The betrayal was staring him in the face. The next morning, as they sat across from each other at the breakfast table, he could hardly find the words. But he had to ask. "Emily," he said, his voice low and steady, "I need to know. Who is Ethan?" Emily froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. But that surprise quickly morphed into something else. Guilt, fear, maybe even shame. "David, I didn't want you to find out this way," she stammered. He didn't need to hear more. He already knew. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Are you having an affair with him?" Emily closed her eyes, tears welling up in her eyes as she nodded. "Yes, David, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. David felt the air leave his lungs. The woman he had trusted above all others had betrayed him. The world around him seemed to fade into the background, leaving him with the cold, cruel truth. "I don't understand," David whispered, barely able to hold back his tears. "Why? After everything we've built?" "I don't know," Emily said, her voice shaking. I felt so alone. I thought I could fix things before it came to this, but I couldn't." The breaking point. As the days passed, the tension in their home only grew. The love that had once been their foundation now felt like a distant memory. Emily apologized over and over again, but the damage had been done. David couldn't shake the image of Emily with someone else, and no amount of apologies could erase the sting of her betrayal. The constant arguing, the silent treatments, the painful, hurt-filled conversations. It was too much for David. Finally, Emily came to him with a proposition. "David," she said one night, "I think it's time we separated." Her words struck like a blow. He had been dreading this moment, but hearing it out loud felt like the end of the world. "You want to leave?" David asked, his voice trembling. "I think it's for the best," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're both so broken. Maybe it's time we face the reality that we're not the same anymore." David's heart shattered. The woman he loved, his partner, the mother of his children, was walking away. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that everything they had was slipping away, irreparably broken. This is just the beginning of David's journey, a journey of pain, confusion, and heartbreak. What will he do now? Can he ever trust again? Or will the scars of this betrayal last forever? The aftermath, a shattered heart. The days following Emily's departure were a blur for David. Their once bustling home, filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of family, now felt cold and empty. The house was eerily quiet, and David found himself wandering the rooms, searching for some piece of their former life that still made sense. But everywhere he looked, the memories felt like sharp shards, each one reminding him of the life he had lost. Lily and Max, his children, were his only anchor. Their innocent questions about where Mommy was and why she wasn't coming home pulled at David's heart in ways he couldn't put into words. He promised them that everything would be okay, though deep down, he wasn't sure if he could keep that promise. They were just children, too young to fully understand the gravity of what had happened, but David couldn't escape the truth. His family was falling apart, seeking answers. For weeks, David tried to go through the motions of daily life, keeping up with work and taking care of the kids. But his mind was constantly occupied with one thought. Why? Why had Emily done this? What had gone wrong? Was it something he had missed? Had he been so consumed by his work that he had neglected her, driven her into the arms of another man? Or was it something deeper, something that had always been there, hidden behind the smiles and the promises? He couldn't shake the thought of Ethan, the man who had taken his place in Emily's heart, the man who had whispered sweet nothings to her, held her when she was vulnerable, made her feel seen when David had failed to notice her pain. The more David thought about it, the more the questions consumed him. Who was Ethan, really? Was he just another escape for Emily, or had he been a part of their lives from the very beginning? The suspicion gnawed at him, and David realized he needed answers. Answers that only Emily could provide. The encounter. One evening, after a particularly draining day, David decided he couldn't live in the dark anymore. He called Emily and asked if they could meet. The thought of seeing her again, after everything that had happened, filled him with a mixture of dread and longing. Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe, a neutral ground where they could talk without the weight of their broken home hanging over them. When Emily walked in, David was struck by how much she had changed. Her once vibrant demeanor was now shadowed by guilt and regret. Her eyes were tired, haunted, and for the first time, David saw the full weight of the decision she had made. "David, I'm sorry," Emily said before he could speak. "I know I've hurt you beyond words. I never meant for this to happen. I was so lost in my own feelings. I didn't know how to fix it." David looked at her, searching her face for any hint of the woman he had once loved. "Why didn't you come to me? Why Ethan?" "I thought I could handle it on my own," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't want to burden you. You were already so busy, so focused on your work. I felt like I was fading away, and I thought, maybe if I found someone who could see me, maybe I could fix what was broken inside. But I was wrong. I hurt you, David, and I'm so sorry." David didn't know how to respond. The words she was saying, apologetic, remorseful, did little to ease the ache in his chest. He wanted to yell, to demand that she explain herself further, but he knew deep down that the damage had already been done. "What do we do now?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Emily replied, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know if there's any way back. I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I can never undo what I've done." David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had loved this woman once, loved her with all his heart, but now, he wasn't sure what was left to salvage. Was it possible to rebuild what had been broken? Or was this the end of everything they had shared? The road to healing. As weeks passed, David struggled to move on. The pain of betrayal was like an open wound, raw and fresh, no matter how hard he tried to move past it. Emily was no longer a part of his daily life, but her presence still haunted him, lingering in every corner of his mind. At times, he thought about revenge, about confronting Ethan and demanding answers from him, but something held him back. He realized that seeking vengeance wouldn't heal the wounds, it would only deepen them. Instead, he focused on his children, on being the father they needed him to be. They were his priority now, the only thing he could cling to as he tried to rebuild his life. But even with all his efforts, something inside him had shifted. Trust, once a given, was now a fragile thing, something he could no longer give so freely. Could he ever love again? Could he ever trust another person, knowing how easily someone he had trusted could tear his world apart? David didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that healing would take time. A lot of time. A new beginning? One evening, after tucking Lily and Max into bed, David sat alone on the couch, the weight of the past few months pressing down on him. He thought about Emily, about the life they once shared, and about the path ahead. Could he forgive her? Could he find it within himself to let go of the anger and the hurt? David didn't know, but as he sat there, looking out the window at the quiet night, one thought lingered in his mind. Maybe the road to healing starts with letting go of the past. And with that thought, he allowed himself a small glimmer of hope, a hope that, perhaps one day, he could find peace again. The long road ahead, seeking redemption, months had passed, and though David had learned to navigate his daily life with the weight of betrayal still heavy on his chest, he couldn't escape the truth. He was broken. The scar left by Emily's infidelity would never fade completely, but over time, he had come to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the pain and finding a way to move forward, even when the past lingered like a shadow. He threw himself into his work, focusing on projects that allowed him to escape his mind. Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. Designing buildings, shaping new landscapes. These things brought him a fleeting sense of purpose. But when he came home each night to an empty house, the silence would engulf him, and he'd wonder if this was all his life had become. But then something shifted. A conversation with Lily. One evening, as David sat at the dinner table with Lily and Max, his daughter asked him a question that stopped him in his tracks. "Daddy," Lily said, her small voice soft and curious, "do you still love Mom?" David was taken aback. It had been a while since they had talked about Emily, and the question was innocent, yet it cut through him in a way he hadn't expected. His eyes met Lily's, and for a moment, he wasn't sure how to answer. How could he explain to his young daughter the complexities of love and betrayal? "I don't know, sweetie," David finally said, his voice unsteady. "I loved your mom very much, but sometimes, when people hurt you, it's hard to keep that love. I'm trying to figure it out." Lily nodded thoughtfully, her small brow furrowing. "But you still care about her, right?" David smiled softly, wiping a tear that had unexpectedly welled in his eye. "I'll always care about her. She's the mother of you both, and that will never change. But love is something different. It's something that has to be earned, and right now, I need time to heal." Lily seemed to understand, nodding in her innocent way. "It's okay, Daddy. You'll be okay." David didn't know how to tell her that, just like him, she too would have to navigate the complexities of love and loss in her own life. For now, though, he found solace in her words. He would be okay, somehow. The unexpected encounter. A few weeks later, David received a text message that would forever change the course of his healing. It was from Emily. "David, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for one last chance to talk. I want to explain everything." The message shook him to his core. Emily had already left. She had already apologized, but this felt different. His heart raced as he stared at the screen, torn between the pain of the past and the possibility of closure. He thought about ignoring it, pretending he hadn't seen the message. But deep down, David knew that avoiding this conversation would only leave a wound unhealed. He needed to hear her side, even if it hurt. He needed to understand. After a few moments of hesitation, he typed back, "Okay, let's meet." They agreed to meet at a park near their old neighborhood, the place where they had once walked hand in hand, laughing, dreaming of a future together. When David arrived, Emily was already sitting on a bench, her eyes downcast, her posture slumped as though carrying the weight of the world. She looked up as he approached, her face pale and drawn. "David," she whispered, her voice filled with regret, "I don't know how to make this right, but I need you to understand what happened. I need you to know that I never wanted to hurt you." David sat beside her, his heart heavy with anticipation. For a moment, there was silence between them, an unspoken understanding that this conversation wouldn't be easy. "Why Emily?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why him? Why Ethan?" "I don't have an answer for you that makes sense," Emily began, tears streaming down her face. "But I'll try. I felt so lost, so alone. And I made the mistake of thinking that finding someone who showed me attention would fix everything. It wasn't about him. It was about me and my own weaknesses, my own brokenness. I didn't know how to fix it, and I couldn't talk to you because I felt like I was losing you even though you were right there." David closed his eyes, the weight of her words sinking in. "You should have told me. We could have worked through it." "I know," Emily choked out, her voice cracking with emotion. "I failed you, and I will live with that for the rest of my life. David, I didn't want to lose you. I was so afraid that if I told you the truth, it would be the end of everything." Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. "And now I see that I was already too late." The raw honesty in her voice caught David off guard. For a moment, he wondered if he could ever forgive her, if he could ever believe that this wasn't just another excuse. But he knew something important. He couldn't carry the burden of anger anymore. He couldn't let the past continue to control his future. "I can't say that I forgive you yet," David said softly, his heart still heavy. "But I can't keep living with this bitterness either. Maybe, maybe I can learn to forgive. But I need time, Emily. I need time to heal. I understand, Emily whispered, her voice filled with sorrow. I'll wait, David. I'll wait for as long as it takes. The first step toward forgiveness. As David stood up to leave, a strange sense of peace washed over him. It wasn't the peace of reconciliation, not yet, but it was a step toward something new, a step toward healing. For the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again, like the weight on his shoulders was lightening just a little. Maybe it wasn't too late for forgiveness. Maybe the love he once shared with Emily wasn't entirely gone. It would take time, it would take effort, but maybe, just maybe, there could be a new chapter in their story. A chapter not defined by betrayal, but by redemption. And as he walked away, David realized that the most important thing wasn't what Emily had done or how much pain he'd endured. It was what he would do next, how he would rebuild his life. And that, he knew, was something he could control. David's journey was far from over. The road ahead was still filled with uncertainty, but with each small step, he was finding his way toward the light. Would he and Emily find a way back to each other? Would he ever truly heal? Only time would tell, but one thing was clear. David was no longer trapped in the darkness of the past. He was learning to walk toward the future. The weight of choices, a new beginning. Weeks passed, and while David focused on rebuilding his life, a quiet unrest settled within him. The confrontation with Emily had offered him a glimmer of hope, but it wasn't a miracle. Healing, he realized, would be a slow and uncertain process. There were days when he felt overwhelmed by the weight of their fractured past, days when the memories of their happier times seemed so distant, as though they belonged to someone else. David poured his energy into his children, striving to be the father they needed him to be, but something inside him had shifted. Beneath the surface of his day-to-day routines, a quiet voice whispered that perhaps forgiveness wasn't the only way forward. Perhaps there was more at stake than just healing a broken relationship. Unexpected discoveries. It was a Saturday morning when David's world tilted once again. He was sitting in his office, sorting through old files and paperwork, when an envelope arrived, a plain, unmarked envelope that seemed oddly out of place. He opened it with the same sense of curiosity that had carried him through this turbulent journey, only to find a letter inside. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It was from Ethan. David's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words that seemed to pull him back into the chaos of his past. David, I know you're angry. I know you've been hurt, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But there's something I need you to know. I never intended for things to go this far. The truth is, I didn't just fall for Emily. I was drawn into something I couldn't control. She wasn't just looking for affection. She was searching for a way out. And I became part of that escape. But I want you to understand, she wasn't the only one hiding from something. I was hiding too. David's hands shook as he read the rest of the letter. Ethan admitted that their relationship had gone deeper than just physical attraction. There had been a connection, a bond that was harder to define. Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. Ethan had made it sound as though Emily wasn't the only one at fault, as though he too had been lured into a web of secrecy and emotional manipulation. David's mind raced. What did this mean? Was Ethan truly remorseful? Or was this just another part of the tangled web of lies that had already cost him so much? And why had he chosen to reach out now, when so much damage had already been done? The road to confrontation. Unable to shake the tension that had begun to rise within him, David decided he had to speak to Ethan. He couldn't let this new twist in the story go unanswered, not without hearing Ethan's side in person. His mind told him it was a dangerous move, but his heart told him that he couldn't live in ignorance any longer. The next day, he arranged to meet Ethan at a local cafe, the same neutral ground where he had once met Emily. The space felt too small, too close, for what was about to unfold. When Ethan walked in, David couldn't help but notice how different he looked, more nervous, more fragile than the confident man who had once charmed Emily. Ethan looked as though he, too, was haunted by the aftermath of the affair. David, I didn't know if you'd show up, Ethan began, his voice shaking. I understand how much you must hate me right now, but I need you to understand something. This wasn't just about me and Emily. It was about both of us running from something that neither of us knew how to face. David narrowed his eyes, refusing to let his emotions cloud his judgment. You think this is just about running away? He asked, his voice cold. You think you're the victim here too? No, that's not what I'm saying, Ethan replied quickly, his hands fidgeting. I never meant for this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. But Emily had her own reasons for seeking someone else. She was falling apart in ways I didn't understand at first. I wasn't just her lover. I was part of the escape she needed from the life she had built with you. David leaned back in his chair, his thoughts a whirlwind. Was this just another excuse? Or was Ethan telling the truth? He didn't know. But what he did know was that he had a choice to make. A choice that could either bring him peace or pull him further into the darkness. I'm not here for your excuses, Ethan, David said, his voice steady. But I am here for one thing, the truth. And if you think I'm going to let this go without understanding every single part of it, you're wrong. Ethan's face grew pale, and he nodded slowly. I understand. I deserve whatever you give me. But just know, Emily wasn't the only one lost. The words hung in the air between them like a heavy fog, and David was left with a crushing realization. Ethan was just as broken as Emily, but that didn't absolve either of them of their betrayal. The final decision. In the days that followed, David couldn't shake the conversation with Ethan. His mind kept replaying the details, the guilt in Ethan's eyes, the desperation in his voice. There was no closure in this, only more questions, more confusion. He realized that while Emily's betrayal had been painful, it was Ethan's confession that left him paralyzed. What did it all mean? Was this some twisted form of redemption, or just another layer of deception? But as much as he struggled with these thoughts, one thing became clear. David could not keep running from the past. He had to decide whether to confront his pain head-on or let it slowly consume him. Would David choose to confront Emily once more, or would this new discovery mark the final chapter in his search for answers? Could he truly forgive and rebuild, or would the shadows of the past continue to haunt him? As the days ticked by, David found himself standing at a crossroads, each path darker than the last. The journey ahead would be filled with even more difficult choices. Choices that could either lead him back to the man he once was or force him into a future he never imagined. Only one thing was certain. David's story was far from over. The truth no one was supposed to know. Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. David sat in his car outside Emily's house, his mind racing. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to fight over the past. He was here for the truth. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he replayed the video in his mind. We can't keep covering for him. Who was him? Taking a deep breath, David stepped out of the car and walked up to the door. He knocked twice. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Footsteps. A pause. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Emily stood in the doorway, eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected to see him. David, she whispered. His voice was steady. We need to talk. A crack in the lies. Emily hesitated, then stepped aside. David walked in, his eyes scanning the house. It felt colder than before. Quieter, as if something had changed. She closed the door behind him. What do you want? David pulled out his phone, opened the video, and hit play. He watched Emily's face as she heard her own words again. Her expression shifted from surprise to fear. When the video ended, there was silence. David folded his arms. Start talking. Emily swallowed hard. David, No more lies. His voice was sharp. Who are you covering for? Her lips parted as if to speak, but then she froze. Her eyes darted toward the window. A flicker of panic crossed her face. David followed her gaze. There, parked across the street, was a black SUV. Tinted windows. Engine running. Watching. Emily turned back to him, voice barely above a whisper. You shouldn't have come here. David's stomach clenched. What the hell is going on? The name that changed everything. Before he could say anything else, Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him closer. You don't understand, she whispered urgently. This is bigger than you and me. If you dig too deep, you'll get hurt. David refused to back down. Who are you protecting, Emily? Who is he? She opened her mouth to speak, and then, crash. The front window shattered as something heavy was thrown through it. Glass exploded into the room. Emily screamed. David spun around, heart hammering. On the floor, lying in a pile of shattered glass, was a brick. A brick with a note attached. He ripped it off, unfolded it, and read the words scrawled across the page in shaky handwriting. Stop asking questions. David looked at Emily. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. She knew exactly who had sent it. And in that moment, David realized, this wasn't just about an affair. This was about something much, much worse. To be continued, the truth that should have stayed buried. David's blood turned to ice. The brick, the note, the SUV outside. This wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Emily backed away from the shattered window, her entire body trembling. David, you need to leave. Right now. David clenched his fists. I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth. Emily's breathing was ragged. She shook her head. You don't get it. If I tell you, you won't make it out of here alive. David stepped closer. Who are you protecting? His voice was deadly calm. Who is he? Emily squeezed her eyes shut, as if saying the name itself would seal her fate. And then, finally, she whispered it. Your brother. David felt the floor drop beneath him. His stomach twisted into knots. What? His voice barely came out. Emily's eyes were red with tears. It was Lucas. He's the one we were covering for. David staggered back, shaking his head violently. No, that's not, no. Lucas wouldn't. Emily let out a bitter, broken laugh. You think you know him? You don't. You never did. David's mind was spiraling. Lucas, his own brother, the one person who had always stood by him. And then, like a dam breaking, memories came flooding back. The way Lucas had been so insistent on David moving on. How he always tried to steer him away from asking too many questions. The vague answers. The deflections. It's not worth it, man. Just let it go. But now David understood. Lucas wasn't trying to protect him. Lucas was trying to protect himself. Lavro, December 2nd, 2025, 21:55. The final betrayal. The room was suffocating, but David had never felt so awake. His own brother. The man he trusted more than anyone. Why? David's voice was raw. Why would he? Emily wiped a tear away. Because he had more to lose than any of us. David's hands were shaking. Tell me everything. Emily took a deep breath. Lucas, he's been in trouble for years. Not just gambling, but deeper stuff. The kind of people you don't say no to. He was desperate. And when he found out about us, about me and Ethan, he saw an opportunity. David swallowed hard. Opportunity for what? Emily's voice was barely above a whisper. To get rid of you. The words sent a chill down his spine. Lucas told me everything, David. The accident that put you in the hospital? That wasn't an accident. David's vision blurred. His entire body went numb. Lucas set it up, Emily choked out. He needed you out of the way. You were asking too many questions. You were getting too close. So he made sure you wouldn't wake up. David's breath came in short, uneven gasps. The crash. The truck that came out of nowhere. The way no one could ever trace the driver. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a hit. Ordered by his own brother. The final choice. Sirens wailed in the distance. The black SUV outside suddenly peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement. Whoever had been watching them was gone. For now, David could barely stand. His world had shattered into something unrecognizable. His own brother had tried to kill him. Ethan had known. Emily had known. And no one had told him. Emily reached for his arm, her voice desperate. David, what are you going to do? David stared blankly at the shattered glass on the floor. He had spent so much time searching for the truth, but now that he had it, it felt like a curse. There were only two choices left. Run or fight. And David Carlyle wasn't the kind of man to run. He turned to Emily, his jaw set. His heart was hammering, but his voice was steady. I'm going to end this. Before she could protest, he turned and walked out the door. Into the night. Into the storm. Into the final reckoning. A gunshot echoed in the darkness. And then, silence. The end.